Good morning, welcome to Arlington UMC Methodist Church. We're glad that you could be with us today. And as we gather together to worship today, we're beginning a new series on anger management. And today's message is entitled, Look in the Mirror. And as I've announced this in church over the last few weeks that we're going to begin this series, I've heard audible gasps, worried looks, people nudging each other, people oohing and aahing. So I realized that this issue of anger is something that resonates with all of us, either our own life, someone in our lives, something in our history. So I encourage you to stick with us over the next few weeks and see what the Bible has to say about anger and about being angry and about its role in our life, both emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Now, normally I like to have a text and expound upon a text, but today's message is going to be a little different as we're going to define some terms as we begin. And our text may not sound like it has a whole lot to do with anger, but it does have something to do with anger, as you'll see as we get into it. So I'm reading from Matthew, the 7th chapter, verses 3 to 5. Jesus says, "Why do you look at a speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." So as we begin, I want to define a few terms, okay? And kind of center our thoughts around that scripture and around some ideas about anger as we begin. And the first thing I want to address today is, what is anger? Anger is an emotional and physical response to a perceived threat. It causes our body to release adrenaline, our muscles to tighten, our heart rate and blood pressure to rise. It causes our senses to heighten and our extremities to become flush. So when somebody gets mad, your face turns red, your hands turn red, those sorts of things. Now, on one hand, anger serves a vital purpose for us. It gets us ready to face a threat or a perceived threat. But as we'll talk about in a few weeks, sometimes our natural response is not the right response. And it's easy for us to allow something that may have an important role in our life to get outside the boundaries that should be there and to create a lot of harm and hurt to other people. But what's important for us is to understand that all of us deal with anger. It is part of being a human being. And how well we deal with it, how well we process it, how well we manage it in our lives is an important, not just physical and emotional need in our life, it's also a spiritual need. And we'll see that the Bible has a lot to say about anger. So the second question we have today is, who has anger issues? And we all do. Our text this morning out of Matthew, Jesus says, don't look at your brother or sister and say you've got something in your eye when you've got something even worse or bigger in your own eye. Take care of yourself first before you help someone else. And that's important for us because when we come to this issue of anger and anger management, I'm sure many of you have someone in your life that you think, they need to hear this. And the reality is that person's sitting over there thinking, you need to hear this. Because we all struggle with anger and how we express it and its role in our lives. So I encourage you today to take stock of your own life. Look at yourself. Look in the mirror. And when we go through these messages, don't be thinking about someone else. Think about yourself and center on yourself and consider what role anger has in your life. A few years ago, I took a counseling class. It was actually the first half of the training to be a sex therapist. And in it, they had one of the tools that you used with a client would be to have them write an autobiography about the subject, that particular subject in their life. And I encourage you to do that as we begin this series on the issue of anger. I want you to think about anger in your home growing up, your parents, your caregivers, things that you did in anger, what role anger has played in your life. What's one thing you did out of anger that you regret? How do you experience anger? How do you process anger? Think for a moment as we begin this, kind of take stock of yourself and where you're at when it comes to anger before we start looking at everyone else. It's important for us to do. For example, if you look at me as your pastor, you might say, well, he's one calm dude. I hazard a guess you've not seen me ever lose my cool. You've never seen me lose my temper. You've never seen me get angry. And that's because as a pastor, you cannot do that. I remember a few years ago talking to a young pastor who had gotten in a screaming match with someone in his church over a particular issue. And he asked a group of us, what should I do? This has happened and now it's a problem. What should I do? And our response to him was, well, you probably need to move. Because a pastor cannot lose their cool. I remember a few years ago, I was at a church that, people were angry and we had a lot of anger issues as a community. And I remember about 7 or 8 years in, my SPRC chair was sitting with me doing the annual review, and he said, I want to thank you. He said, you've never lost your cool, you've never gotten angry, you never cussed out parishioners, and I want to thank you for that. And if you think that was extreme, there was a pastor that had done that before me. And, I thought about that, and as you look at me as your pastor, you probably think, wow, he doesn't have any anger issues. Well, you can ask my family, you can ask my parents, you can ask my pets, you can ask other people, and, yeah, we all have anger we need to deal with. We all have anger issues we need to confront, and we all need to be honest with ourselves, okay? We need to be honest with ourselves. To everyone else, we may look like we've got it together, but we struggle with anger and we struggle in certain places. So this message is for all of us. Look in the mirror, take the log out of your own eye before we start trying to take the speck out of someone else. Are there different kinds of anger? That's important as we move through these. And there are active and passive forms of anger. Active forms of anger we're probably aware of. They can go to extremes like violence against property, persons, or yourself, screaming, yelling, verbal assaults, those sorts of things. And we're aware of anger in that manner. And studies find that that's typically kind of the anger that men typically gravitate towards. And the thing with that kind of anger is it's not socially acceptable. And if we express anger in that way, we normally need to process anger pretty quickly. And we have to apologize and clean up the messes that we've made. But we all know what active anger looks like. But there's also passive forms of anger. Passive forms of anger is when you don't actually deal with the situation that's made you angry, but you direct your anger towards indirectly in things that have nothing to do with it. That's classic passive aggressiveness. And passive aggressiveness is still anger, and it still is a problem. Passive aggressiveness looks like this. Let's say you get mad at me, and you're like, Pastor Mark, I'm mad at you, and something you said, something you did, something you didn't do, and I'm mad at you. But I'm not going to tell you about it. We're not going to address it. We're not going to resolve it. We're not going to actually deal with it. I'm going to call you up 3 weeks later and tell you I'm not helping at Vacation Bible School. That's passive aggressiveness. Passive aggressiveness is a form of anger, and it's a passive form of anger. And as we'll talk about in a few weeks, a very insidious form of anger. Because the active forms of anger, when we express those, we know we did something wrong or not socially acceptable. Passive aggressiveness, no one likes this, but it's not something you're going to get arrested for. Okay, and it really in many ways can be a very destructive form of anger, because a person can apologize to you and reconcile to you, but you still hold on to that anger and still express it somewhere else. Now, historically, we found that men typically struggle with the active expressions of anger, and women struggle with the passive forms of anger. And that's a generalization, I know, and we all can kind of do both of those at the same time. But understand that this has an effect upon us, and we need to address the kinds of anger we have. Just because you have passive forms of anger and society doesn't throw you in jail for it, doesn't mean it's any better. And so as we talk about this, and we'll talk about the different kinds of anger as we move through this series, and we'll talk about how we need to deal with them. And lastly, what's so wrong with being mad? If being angry is a natural response to a perceived threat, what's the problem with it? Well, the problem is when we don't manage it, when we don't deal with it. Did you see some of the things that anger does? It raises our heart rate, our blood pressure. It affects our physical well-being. It affects our relationships. It affects who we are physically, spiritually, and emotionally, and other people. When we have anger without boundaries, when we don't understand it and process it and manage it, then anger can become a very, very destructive force in our lives and in the lives of others. And I think we all know that. And that's why it's important for us to see what the Bible has to say about anger. And the Bible has a lot to say about anger. In the Old Testament, anger is perceived as folly, not being wise. It's perceived as something that's not helpful. It's perceived as something that usually gives us bad outcomes. In the New Testament, we'll actually increase that negativity around anger to the point that anger becomes sin. Particularly, the expression of anger without boundaries. Paul says in Galatians 5:19-21, he's talking about a list of things that will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. Listen very closely. Things that will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. And one of them is fits of rage. And that, of course, is, anger without any management or without any boundaries. And so it's also a sin problem for us. And what happens to others and to ourselves is not God's design for us. So it's important for us to manage our anger, to talk about our anger, to manage our anger, and to learn how to process it in holy and just ways that we can be helpful and useful to God's kingdom. So as we look at anger in the Bible, I encourage you to be here. But more importantly today, I encourage you to start with Jesus' words. Look at yourself. It's very tempting on this subject to want to look at everybody else, but look at yourself and see where you struggle with anger, where we can do better, and we can be more holy. Let us pray. Lord, you made us who we are, and Lord, there's some things that we need to manage better. There's some things that we need to have more control over. And Lord, you've called us to that. And Lord, we live in an age that's very angry. We live in an age where people are telling us that rage is something that is good and just. And Lord, help us to hear your word today. And it may be hard for us to hear, but help us to understand, Lord, that words said in anger, things done in anger,